All right, good morning. Last time I get to say that to you in person, right? Good morning, good morning. Everyone have a good weekend? My children won my twins, my 8-year-olds, we had a very long softball game and they won the championship game on Saturday, which was very exciting. I got awfully sunburned. It was normally games are like an hour and 20 minutes. It was 2 hours and 15 minutes, double overtime for these little kids, right? Crazy double international overtime rules for softball. But my 8-year-olds won their championship, which was kind of fun. And another cake because it was Mother's Day. I get Father's Day in our house, but I bought a cake for my partner, and so we had more cake, more victories, and there was a cake at the softball party. 2 cakes this weekend. It's been a good cake month, and it's only the 9th, and I've had like 8 cakes this month. That's a good month right there. It's a really good month. That's a solid showing for May, and there's still 3 weeks left, so I could up that. I could top that for sure. You got a hearty laugh out of that. I like that. So anyway, what we'll do today, we'll finish up the other half of the chapter. It's just a couple of slides to talk about how the law affects psychology, and then I'll talk just a little bit at the end, just a few reminders about the final exam, which is on Wednesday. But this will be our last day of lecture, and we'll wrap this up, and then we'll almost call it a semester. We still have the final to go. So last time, right, we went over all of those famous insanity plea cases. So that first half was all about how, that psychology affects the law, that it affects legal proceedings and all of that kind of stuff. What we're looking at in this half is how legal stuff affects those who are practicing psychology. Anyone in here planning on maybe being a therapist or a social worker, a counselor of some kind? Lots of you. So these are all things that kind of affect that side. If you're practicing, whether it's as a teacher, a researcher, or a therapist of some capacity, there are rules to protect you and also protect your clients. And that's what we'll look at on this other side today. And this is a very difficult topic. It's very case by case. It's a lot of like consulting and getting other people's opinions. But what we're looking at here is as a concept of protecting patients' rights first, and then we kind of go and add on to that on the next slide. But there are some cases where an individual can be forced into mental health treatment for a very limited amount of time. Usually 72 hours is the amount of a hold. If you've ever heard the term 5150, that is the legal term or the legal code for detaining someone because they are fitting the criteria for a civil commitment. Anyone know why we might detain someone? Why would we have a 5150? Yeah.
It's usually to help protect themselves or other people.
Yeah.
If they have an intent to harm themselves, you can get locked up for 72 hours, or
Mhm.
if you have an intent to harm other people,
Yep.
you will get locked up.
Perfect, right? So if somebody's a danger to themselves or others, we can have them committed either in a jail or like a psychiatric facility or a ward in a hospital. They can be committed for up to 72 hours. Now, this gets tricky if they're underage, or even if they're an adult. There's lots of circumstances and ways around this. But if somebody is a serious threat to themselves or others, this is something that we can pursue. And patients have rights, right? This wasn't always the case. If you remember way back to chapter 1, we did all sorts of awful, inhumane things. Locking people in asylums was a very common practice where they didn't receive any kind of treatment. And so what we have to do is walk a very fine line. Clients have the right to treatment, but they also have the right to refuse treatment most of the time. Again, there's always like caveats in this chapter, but you can't put somebody in a facility or you can't like detain someone and then not give them adequate treatment. That is a very like basic right that people have. If I believe that you need like mental health treatments, I need to do something to give you adequate treatment. I can't just lock you away involuntarily and not help you in any capacity. But at the same time, I can't force you to undergo treatment, right? I can't say like you are receiving this medication and you have no ability to say no to that. Patients have the right to refuse treatment as long as they are of sound mind. Now, if somebody has something like schizophrenia, right, and they don't maybe understand the treatment options being offered, or they don't understand reality going on around them, a family member can actually override that and sign for it and assume like the responsibility and get them treatment despite that person's wishes. But for the most part, you can't put somebody in a facility and be like, I'm requiring you to take this medication. That patient has the right to say no, again, as long as they are of sound mind. And this is a very difficult balancing act. You don't want to unintentionally deprive someone of opportunities to get better and to recover, but you also don't want to force somebody to undergo a treatment that they're not interested in. Right. And so it's using your best judgment. But the idea here is that we can't just lock you away and not help you in some capacity, like we did for years and years with patients or clients that suffered from mental illness. And there's a movie a few years back, I want to say it was almost like 10 years ago at this point, but I'm going to play the trailer for you. It's a really like interesting movie with like a cool psychological twist. I love those movies with like a psych twist to them. They're the best, right? But in this movie, it's called Unsane. I don't know if any of you heard of it. Unsane. It wasn't a super popular movie, but in this movie, the woman is tricked into committing herself to a psychiatric hospital, and then they won't let her out. And like this couldn't happen in real life. And then there's this whole other plot of like someone who's a stalker. So you don't know if maybe she's of right mind or not. There's all these like twists to it. But let me show you the trailer for this. She goes in for like help, and they commit her. And then again, she can't get out, which wouldn't happen. But it gets tricky if we don't think this person is of sound mind and they're hallucinating or have delusions, then maybe they might be acting in her best interest. So let me pause this and then I'll show you the trailers, just a couple of minutes. Looking about, right? She goes in and just signs some forms. Like she went in to get some help with like an assessment, and she basically got tricked into voluntarily committing herself. And because she does that, they take her back and then they won't let her leave. And I think that's the tricky thing that sometimes people face with mental health treatment is they don't believe her when she's saying this stuff because she's in the psychiatric facility. Like the woman says, you know how many calls the police get from people in this facility saying I'm being held against my will. And there's this whole like underlying plot that I won't reveal in case you want to watch it, but you can't be held against your will, right? You can't. Unless they like, there's some little loopholes in there. So it's a really interesting movie to watch, kind of walking this fine line. Again, you have the right to say, I don't want to take that medication, which you don't see in that film. So it's a little bit of like a Hollywood version of it, but a very important thing. You have to protect patients' rights, right? You don't want to overtreat them, but you don't want to undertreat them. And so we have to walk that little bit of a fine line. Our last slide. Let that sink in. This is our last slide. It'll take us a little bit to get through it, but it's our last one. If you're practicing in the field of mental health, there are an incredible number of ethical guidelines that you have to follow. And you take a whole class called Ethical Guidelines in graduate school, and it's a very difficult class because everything is like a gray area. There's constant, it's not always black and white, like we tend to think of it being. But these are ethical guidelines that are meant to protect not only the person who's practicing as a therapist or a researcher or professor or whatnot, but also to protect the clients, right? Typically, we call a person a client if they're in therapy or a patient if they've been hospitalized. But these are rights to protect everyone. And they're guidelines that if they're not followed can be severe. You can lose your license, you can go to jail, you can be fined a lot of money. And so in general, what you want to do is make your best faith effort as a therapist or a clinician or researcher. And you don't want to violate these, otherwise you could be subject to consequences. So these ethics are bodies of principles and rules designed to guide our decisions and our actions. And there are a bunch of them. The first one is super basic. Psychologists are permitted to offer advice. You are permitted as a therapist to offer advice to your clients, to your students, to whoever. You can go on TV or the radio and offer advice. That is allowed. They don't have to follow your advice, but you're able to give it, as long as you are giving it within your area of expertise. You can't offer advice on something that you know nothing about and be free from consequences. Really important as a therapist or researcher or clinician that you acknowledge your limitations, which is the third one. If you don't know enough about something to help a client or to offer advice, you shouldn't do it. You should refer them out to somebody else. or just not give advice on that subject. And again, it's not like a clear-cut line, but if you aren't comfortable and confident in your knowledge, you should refer someone out to another therapist or another client or another resource, I should say. You're not allowed to conduct any kind of fraudulent research or publish false data. If you like fabricate data or publish data that isn't correct, you could lose your license, you could go to jail, you could be just shunned in the academic or like experimental community. So you have to publish things that are correct and not fabricated in any way. If you make evaluations or testify in legal cases, it has to be based on sufficient information, and you have to substantiate your findings appropriately. It needs to be neutral and unbiased and based off of accurate information. You need to avoid any kind of what we call a dual relationship. As a therapist, you have power over your client in a way that makes them vulnerable. You cannot have what's called a dual relationship with a client, right? So if I was still a therapist, which I'm obviously not anymore, but if I was a therapist, I could not be your teacher and your therapist. That would be a dual relationship. I couldn't be your therapist and your friend, right? Sadly, right? Like that's not allowed. Right? Because it creates a dual power dynamic. I can't be your teacher and also your like friend, or at least I shouldn't be. People break that rule sometimes, but I shouldn't be. It makes it where you can't be objective anymore because that person has that dual relationship. Now, this can get really tricky in small towns. I went to school at Humboldt State, which is a very small town compared to here. Right? And when I was in my master's program, I was also working at Starbucks. That was fine for a time, but I had a day where one of my clients came into Starbucks. How awkward is that, right? You don't want to go into Starbucks and your barista is also your therapist, right? Not okay. That is a dual power relationship that made both of us incredibly uncomfortable. That was my last day, or I put in my 2 weeks at that point. I couldn't work there anymore because it was a small community. At that point, as a professional, I shouldn't also be working in a capacity where anyone could come in and I could be serving them like that. If you are in a small town and your client is a dentist, you should not see that person if you need a dentist. You need to go find somebody else because that creates a dual relationship. Even if it means you have to drive towns over, right? You can't have them as your dentist because it creates this weird power dynamic where you could take advantage of them or they could owe you or you owe them in some way, and that shouldn't happen. Right? So you have to have clear boundaries, which isn't always the easiest thing to do. Once that client, it was such a bad situation. Once that client knew that I worked at Starbucks, he would come in every day and just sit there in the lobby and stare at me. Right? So I was very glad when those 2 weeks were up. Right? I had a lot of issues with boundaries with this client anyway. He would call me repeatedly. I think he called me like 72 times one day. Just like boundary issues. So it's very important to avoid dual relationships whenever possible. You cannot take advantage of a client or a student sexually or otherwise, which relates to this very, very closely. Right? So when you have someone who is your client, you actually have to wait 2 years before you can enter into a romantic relationship with them. So mark your calendar, right? They come in, even if it's one session. If you feel like a chemistry with that person and they have interest in you and you have interest in them, you have to wait 2 years legally and ethically before you can enter into a romantic relationship. You can't have like physical and sexual interactions with the therapist. That is a violation of a power dynamic, a violation of trust. It could cost you your license or you could go to jail. Very, very serious thing. You see it in the media all the time, right? Therapists like engaging in like inappropriate behaviors with their clients. That is a huge taboo, and it's not allowed. And it could be so much more minor than that. You know, a lot of therapists don't even try to touch clients in any way. It depends on your modality. There are some therapists who are touch oriented or like sensory motor therapists where touch is more encouraged. But in most therapeutic stances and in most places, you cannot even like have physical contact with the therapist. Gets a little blurrier when clients are children, because oftentimes kids want to give their therapist hugs and it's kind of an important bonding thing. But as two adults, you shouldn't be. Like there should be no physical interaction with the therapist, no touch, no like boundaries being violated in any way. Really interesting, even down to like if you see your therapist out in public, they probably won't acknowledge you. And that's actually a confidentiality rule. A therapist is not supposed to say hello to a client in public because it could give away the nature of their relationship. If the client says hello, they can reply back and say hi, but you're not supposed to even acknowledge someone outside of the therapy office. This was something that was always so hard in a small town. I'd see people all the time and like I'd get weird because like I would get all formal and like trying to hide, right? Like, because I didn't want to make them feel uncomfortable. And my partner every time would be like, what's wrong? Like, what? Like, what? Why are you hiding? And like, I'm just hiding, like I wasn't supposed to say. And she knew every time, like, do you have a client here? I'm like, maybe, because you're not supposed to tell anyone those things. And it's a violation of trust and confidentiality. You have to be very, very careful with that. Confidentiality is a huge one when it comes to ethical principles. You want to feel like the things that you tell a therapist are going to stay with that therapist. If you don't trust that they're not going to tell someone else, why would you be honest and open with them? Right. And so there's a very, very strict rule that you will not divulge any information that you obtain from a client. There are some exceptions, though, right? There are cases where you have a duty to protect your client or other people, and you can violate that confidentiality. So if a client comes to you and they say, like, I'm planning on hurting myself tonight, you have a duty to protect that client. And you need to do something to help them, to help make every effort you can to prevent them from hurting themselves. So that might be getting them connected to resources. It might be that civil commitment that we talked about a moment ago, but you have a duty to protect them. If your client comes to you and says, I plan to murder 30 people tomorrow, you have a duty to protect those 30 people, right? You need to call somebody, you need to report that information and make your good faith effort to protect them. If somebody gives you an example of, or talks about child abuse or elder abuse, you also have a duty to protect those people and report it. 2 times when I was a therapist, I had to make a child like protective services report or an elder protective services report. I had a case where a child was in active danger and I had to report that to an agency where they follow up and they go make sure everything's okay. I also had a client who was being financially taken advantage of. She was older and of diminished like mental capacity. She was struggling with dementia and she had started dating someone who was stealing money from her, right? Or I suspected was stealing money from her. And because she was older, I had to report it and somebody else had to follow up on it and make sure everything was investigated. So there are cases where you have a duty to protect your client or other people. But here's where it gets really crazy. You could have a client come to you and say, I killed 30 people last week, and you cannot report that. You cannot say anything. If you do, you are violating confidentiality and you could get in trouble for that. Now, if they say I'm killing 30 people tomorrow, you have to do something. I killed 30 people last week, cannot report it. It's almost like you went to confession, right? If you went to confession and told a priest I killed 30 people, they cannot report that. So there's all these like rules that you have to follow as a therapist. You have to make sure that you keep things secret and confidential, but you have to also protect people if it violates that guideline. Is that any questions? I have a few more things here, but any questions or thoughts or anything so far? Right, it's always a crazy one to think that someone could tell you that they murdered like people and you can't do anything with that information, right? And I have to tell you that this was one of the hardest things for me as a therapist. There were a few things that were difficult for me, but I'm such a like talk things out kind of person. My partner and I talk about everything, like maybe too much, right? And I would go home after a long day of therapy and I couldn't tell my partner about anything that happened. And that was always really hard for me to be like, you can give away some stuff like general vague stuff. Like I could say I had a client today who's struggling with cancer and that was really hard. But I can't say like male or female or identifying information or names or anything much more than that. But that was always something that was difficult for me. Same thing with, to be honest, and I think I mentioned this before, or at least to a few of you, maybe privately, therapy was really hard for me. I'm a very sensitive person and I care a lot about people. And that was something that was hard for me as a therapist. You have to have good boundaries, right, with therapy. And I wasn't something that I was great at. Like I would have clients who were suicidal and I would stay up all night worrying about them. I'd want to call them and check on them. And I really shouldn't have. Right. Or I would go home and I'd worry about my clients and I'd like have stomach aches because I felt so bad for them. Right. And so that's something that, you have to work on as a therapist. And very common because of that therapists go to therapy themselves. It's actually really encouraged. Most therapists will go to other therapists to talk about their caseloads because that other therapist is also bound by confidentiality. You can go and talk to another therapist about a client. And you can consult with them and get advice and process things that have come up, and that's allowed. And so when you're going through the hours, you have to do something like 3,000 hours before you can take the licensing exam. If you go to therapy yourself, they count it double, right, as an hour. So instead of 1 hour, they give you 2. So it's very common and encouraged for therapists to go to therapy to get help processing some of these things. And for me, the way I knew I didn't want to be a therapist was I would always watch the clock and wish that our time was up because it gave me so much anxiety versus when I was teaching, I'd watch the clock and wish we had more time. And that was very telling for me. It's important to have good boundaries, right? And my therapist that I go to therapy, have gone since I was a baby. My therapist now has such good boundaries and it drives me nuts sometimes because I'm always pushing the boundaries. Like I'll email her and she won't email me back for like a specific amount of time. Or if I email her twice in a day, she won't write me back because only once is allowed, right? That's her rule, not like a general one. But we have to have good boundaries as therapists in order to not be taken advantage of or give our clients the wrong impression. Tons of other little rules. You're not supposed to accept gifts from clients because it creates, again, like an awkward power dynamic. You're also not supposed to give gifts as a client, but sometimes they do. In Humboldt, I once had a client bring me a plate of brownies. And I was really nervous about those brownies living in Humboldt. I was like, are they just brownies or are they more? But I didn't want to be rude. You're not supposed to accept gifts, but I was like, I'll put these in the room and like the staff lounge and everyone can enjoy them. I'll put them in there and see what happens to the other therapist first. It's probably not very nice of me. But you're not supposed to accept things because it creates an awkward dynamic. But oftentimes clients want to thank you and give you things. And so it's a very delicate balance. You don't want to offend them, but you also don't want to accept it and create like an uneven power dynamic. You're not supposed to hug your clients, right? As another one, again, with the touch, right? If a client asks you for a hug, you can give one, but you have to give like a tent hug where you're like, don't let your bodies touch, right? There's all these like rules that you would learn. And it's a very like case by case kind of thing. And so what they always encourage is for you to act in like a best faith effort and to consult with other therapists, which is why, again, so many therapists go to therapy themselves. And the whole idea here is you're trying to protect yourself as a therapist, but also your clients. You don't want to take advantage of them or create an awkward power dynamic, and you don't want to get in trouble for something that was kind of a gray area either. So just an absolute ton of these different ethical guidelines, and it's a very, as I said, case by case kind of basis. But these are some of the really big ones. Anyone have any other like questions or thoughts? Anything related to this? Like other questions about guidelines or ethics with therapy? Yeah.
Is therapy like? Are you able to do it outdoors, like in a public place?
Yeah. It depends on. So if you practice in like a private practice, you have a lot more freedom than if you practice, like, say you're part of like Kaiser or part of like a big medical group, then you're often at the mercy of their rules. But if you are a private practice therapist, then you can often kind of decide for yourself. So you could go on a walk with your client or meet outside if that's what they want and you want, you're fine with it. And there aren't other people around. But if you're within like a big company or corporation, they often have rules about that. You have to stay in a room where everything is kept like contained or private. You'll also notice like big companies, oftentimes the therapy doors have like glass, so anyone could see in when they walk by, just to make sure that like, it's another level of accountability. So it depends on the company and the private practice that you're in. Anyone else? Other questions or thoughts or anything here? I'm gonna stall as long as possible because I don't want to let you leave. Right. I always hate the last day because I don't want you to leave because I won't forget. But these are really, really, as I said, really important. There's even more of them. And if you break these, loss of a license, jail time, suspension, or even fines. Fines is usually the most common, but losing a license is just devastating. If you've gone think about all the years of schooling and therapy hours and all the money and everything you've done, and you can no longer practice because you've violated ethical principles. And these also account, as I said, for professors and researchers as well. Really important. You can't have, therapists, clients, so you can't teachers. You can't have those dual power dynamics at all. So a couple of things, as I said, we definitely wouldn't take the whole time today, but I want to talk about this for just a moment. Remember that on Wednesday, what will happen? Let me bring this up here. On Wednesday morning, if I go to our class, exam number 3 will open up at 12:01 a.m. on Wednesday. Okay, so Wednesday morning at 12:01 a.m., the test will open up on here. And it is, if you want to go to student view, if you go all the way down on the module list, all the way down, watch your eyes, right? You can see here's exam number 3 right here. And it's with 100 points. So that will open up Wednesday morning at 12:01 a.m. and it'll close Wednesday night at 11:59 p.m. So make sure sometime before 11:59 p.m. that you take the test. Same format as the other ones, right? It's all open note, open book. There's some short answer questions and I'll grade them afterward. If you go all the way back up to the top, the study guide is posted all the way up here. Here's study guide number 3 in that first section of documents. So make sure you use that to help you study and prepare. Even though it's open note and open book, you want to make sure you're ready to go and prepare for that. I've said this a few times as well. Make sure that you're double checking your scores, right? Now is a great time. Sometime before Wednesday, if something looks wrong, email me. If something is like empty and it shouldn't be, email me. If you never turned in a paper, you can still turn it in for 50%, and half points is definitely way better than no points. But make sure that you're going through and checking your scores. Make sure that you get the exam in on that day. I will be here. So if you have questions, you want to come check in with me, send me an email. We can set up a time just to make sure that I'm free and available for that. But I will be here on Wednesday and Thursday and Tuesday if you want to come by my office and check in. Otherwise, that's really kind of all that I have for you. Of like 1 or 2 other comments, but are there any questions? Any questions here? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. That was for my my intro site. Okay. It's on here. Thank you. I don't want to confuse you. Canvas. My intro site class was on the difference. But yes, it's right here on Canvas, and it's the same format and style as everything you've done before. Anything else? So I want to say thank you. This has been a weird. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a hand? Please stall me. I don't know.
But with like what was it, the duty to protect or something?
Yeah, here I can go back to it.
How is like if there's something like child. So do you have to inform them that you put it, or is it like?
So oftentimes it's something that you would do. So like if a client started to tell you about something, you might remind them in that moment. Like I really want to hear what you have to say, but I just want to remind you that if you tell me about an active case of child abuse, I am required by law to report it. I just want to make sure you know that before you continue. And most people are kind of aware of that, but reminding them never hurts because you don't want them to be mad at you, right? For violating your trust. But so it wouldn't hurt to remind them if they start to say like, I'm planning on doing X, be like, I just want to remind you that I am required to report this if you tell me much more. And that's very commonly done. Yeah.
I have a question about with confidentiality. What if a client is like under a conservatorship?
How do you mean?
You know how like some people, you know, conservatorship where
Uh-huh.
another person gains their legal rights?
Okay.
Do you report to the people that,
Yeah, it gets super complicated right now where you have like the HIPAA laws, right? If you're someone who's a minor. I mean, there's a lot of cases where the information, like, I mean, even here at the school, right? Like people worry sometimes like, oh, if I go to the therapist here, is that going to go on my record? No. But if you go as a minor or you have like somebody else who's legally responsible for you and you're being like watched or like monitored, in some cases, the rules might be a little bit different. So usually what happens with those situations is you might have like an extra document that is signed and reviewed of like, these are the limits to our relationship and what I'm allowed to divulge and not divulge. So when there's extenuating circumstances, you usually have like an additional level of like a document or something that would let that client know where their boundaries are. Yeah, but it gets messy. It definitely gets messy. I had another, where did I go? I was here. I had another thought, but I was going to say thank you, right? This by far has been like the strangest semester. I've taught for 14 years and this like by far, like not even close, like at least the last semesters were online and that's how it was. I know you all signed up for in-person and then we were online for like 8 weeks and then we were in person, but some things are still online. And then I went to the hospital and was gone for like a week and a half. I just want to say thank you for your patience. I've tried very hard to be very organized and like on it with everything. And so I hope at every point you felt like taken care of in that sense. And with the exams being online, most of you have amazing grades in the class, maybe much easier, higher grades than you would have had if it had all been in person. But I just want to say thank you for your flexibility and for just rolling with whatever they threw at us. Masks, then no masks, and online, and then not online, and then back online. And, you know, I mean, it could have been worse, but it was enough. And so I just want to say thank you for that. And thank you for being here and braving it. I mean, I had so many of you. Some of my colleagues have like 3 people in their class. I'm so grateful that I've had like in the 20s. It's really nice. So I feel like we had a great class and I'm sad that it's over and I'm totally stalling. So I'm gonna stop talking and I'm gonna let you go, but good luck on your other finals. I hope you have a great summer. I teach other classes here if you haven't had enough of me, come join me again. But don't forget about the exam. I'll send out an announcement and a reminder and take care of yourselves and get out. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Have a wonderful summer. And again, I'm here if you have questions or anything.